Hi, it's good to be back again. I thought today it would be nice to follow up on what we talked about last week. And if you saw my video from last week, you will remember that I talked about yarns that I felt were a good recommendation for first-time weavers or for inexperienced weavers. So today I'm just going to take it one step further, and I'm going to talk about a couple of yarns that I would never use in my warp. Because our warp yarns, if you think about it, have very special requirements. First of all, our woolen yarns, some of them have more stretch than others. So you need to actually take this into consideration, because a yarn that is loosely spun is going to stretch more than a yarn that is slightly more tightly spun. So this yarn, which I also used in my demonstration last week, has a certain amount of stretch, and then after that it's very stable, and it's an absolutely great yarn that you can use in your warp. Also, if I bring my hand much closer, I just want you to look at the structure of this. Just wait. Look at this yarn. You can see very clearly that it has a definite twist to it. And if I untwist it, just in my fingers, and I separate it out, you can see that it's actually made up of not 2, but 4 separate strands of yarn. This is what we call a plied yarn. So if anybody's watching this and they're spinners, they will know exactly what I'm talking about. A single strand of yarn on its own is called a singles, believe it or not. As soon as you have 2 or more strands of yarn twisted together, we call it a plied yarn. And the heavier the twist in your plied yarn, the stronger that your plied yarn is going to be. So one of the things that comes up over and over on social media is people doing the tug test to see whether a yarn is potentially strong enough to use it in the warp. Well, that's actually a load of rubbish. What you need to do when you do the tug test is you hold your fiber between thumb and forefinger, and if you can press against it and it snaps like that, then you can't use it for your warp. It's not strong enough. However, that was just one thread of my plied yarn. If I do the same thing with my plied yarn, there is no way that I'm going to break that yarn. So that's the first thing. Your warp yarn needs to be strong, not unbreakably strong. I can still take this yarn and snap it, just like that. But I can't, if I do the tug test the correct way, I cannot break it. That means that this yarn is great to use in your warp. This yarn is much thicker than the first yarn, if you think about it. But let's have a look at it. If I untwist this, you can see that in fact it's not about separate strands of yarn twisted together. That's just a whole lot of fiber twisted together. And even though this is a much thicker yarn than the previous one, if I do my test on it, it's going to break. So this is a singles yarn. A singles yarn is not a good idea to use in your warp. As we move our heddles up and down, whether you're working on a table loom or on a rigid heddle loom, our warp yarns undergo a certain amount of friction, and a singles yarn wears through. So that's one yarn that I never would use in my warp. So we can toss it out of the way. The second type of yarn that I would never use in my warp is something like this. This is a mohair blend yarn. Again, it also has a bit of acrylic in it, but it is predominantly mohair. And you can see all these little fibers coming off the yarn. If you use that in your warp, your fibers are going to bind onto each other and you're not going to be able to open the shed. This works great. It works beautifully if you use it in the weft, but please don't use it in the warp. It's the second thing. You don't want to have any kind of bits and pieces floating off the main shaft of your warp yarn. This yarn, however, let me just see if I can pull off a little bit more of that. This is what we call a boucle or a looped boucle. And how they construct this yarn is they take all those loose fibers from the previous one and they kind of spin them back into the core of the yarn, if that makes sense. This, strangely enough, works very well in the warp because there aren't really any loose fibers. We've got these loops, but the loops haven't got their, they don't have a sort of a fluffy end sticking out like the blue one. Can you see that? So a looped mohair you can use very effectively in your warp, but certainly not a brushed mohair. Here's another one that is not a good idea for a rigid heddle weaver in particular. This beautiful yarn, and I do love this, is in fact a singles yarn, but I cannot budge it if I try and break it. And that, friends, is because this is a line linen. Linen is just such a special yarn to work with, but it doesn't work for everybody. So I would use this as a warp on my table loom or my floor loom, but I would not use it on my rigid heddle loom. And that is because our linen takes us to the other extreme from the really stretchy stuff. So this is not particularly stretchy, this brown one, but some of our merino yarns are really stretchy, and linen goes to the other extreme. It has no elasticity at all. So every time we move our heddle up or down, our linen fibers stretch out infinitesimally, but they don't stretch out evenly. And because on our rigid heddle looms, it's only the threads that are in the holes that actually move. The threads that are in the slots stay in the same place all the time. The threads that are in the holes stretch and stretch and stretch and stretch, and eventually you lose all of your tension. Now you can use a linen yarn very effectively in the warp if it is combined with something else. So something like a cottolin, and I don't have a cottolin here to show you, but the cottolin that I use is about 60% cotton, 40% linen, and that is a lovely yarn to use in the warp. But a pure linen and a line linen like this, I would avoid. So just to recap, your warp yarn needs to be smooth, it needs to be relatively strong, it needs to be a plyed yarn, and it shouldn't be linen. If you found this video clip useful, please feel free to go along and investigate my Patreon page. Patreon provides the funding that allows me to actually continue to make these. So if you would like to subscribe to my Patreon page and perhaps make a small regular subscription, it would be very much appreciated. The links to my website and my Patreon are at the top of the page under the banner. I'll see you next week. I appreciate your time.